Okay, here we go, guys. We are live on Standing for Truth, and I want to welcome everybody here for tonight's very, very important show. We are discussing the geology of Charles Darwin. We've already got a great chat. Good to see everybody. God bless everybody for being here tonight. I want to let you know we are going to be having an audience Q&A as well. So please tag me with your questions. We've got Professor David McQueen back with us here tonight. Now, we did just hit the 4,000 subscriber mark, as well as 10,500 subscribers on the Young Earth Creation channel. So I know we've got a lot of new viewers, a lot of new subscribers. So I want to remind everybody to check out the playlist that I have in the description box of this video with all of our shows with Professor David McQueen. He has been an incredible blessing, and those shows in that series are a must watch. So for people who might not be familiar with Professor David McQueen, I want to give him a brief introduction. So David R. McQueen was trained in mineralogy at the University of Tennessee, a BA in geology, and at the University of Michigan, an MS in geology. McQueen taught college geology at George Mason University, Virginia State University, East Tennessee State University, and the Institute for Creation's Graduate School. So please, once again, check the description box for more on Professor David McQueen, as well as a link to his must-have book. And a couple reminders, actually, before I bring in the guests for tonight, because we've got another busy week with debates, interviews, and shows. Tomorrow we have a debate on the topic, are the 10 Commandments ethical? So that debate kicks off at 3 p.m. And on the 20th, we've got Kent Hovind back with us discussing lies in the textbook. There will be an audience Q&A. And on the 26th, we've got Dr. Charles Jackson back here as well for a show on the missing facts of evolution, Big Bang to Homo sapiens. So that is going to be one that you do not want to miss. And I also want to announce this one on May 28th. We've got the entire creation research team with us, Dr. Diane Eager, Joseph Hubbard, and John McKay for a presentation on Out of Adam, the Real Racial History of Man. So guys, please keep yourselves up to date. Check the upcoming live stream section for all the events we have planned in the future. We've also got Michael J. Ord back with us on the 9th. So anyways, enough for me. We've got a great chat. I'm going to bring in Professor David McQueen here and our award-winning co-host, George Bond. Gentlemen.
I've been reading yours. I can't stay awake. It's so boring.
Well, are we on? Are we on?
Are we on?
We're live, gentlemen.
Standing for Truth. You woke me up.
I told you not to read that book before we go live.
And I've been reading this, and I've fallen asleep. How about you, George?
I fell asleep 2 days ago when I first started reading it. But
You've been sleeping for 2 days, George.
I've got a bit of a beef to take up with Mr. SFT there. You mentioned all those qualifications of the good professor. What about my five PhDs?
Yes,
I know.
Yes, as an engineer, George learned to use a post-hole digger, PhD. He's got 5 of them. It's the only profession where you start at the top and work down.
Did you know SFT has 10 PhDs? 10
from Harvard.
Well, I want him to send me one. George, we have to jazz up Origin of Species. It's so boring. Let's actually let's go on the road. Let's go on the road, and we'll call our group. It'll be a smooth jazz group. We'll call it Darwin, George, and Smooth Dave. We'll tour the world.
Sounds good. Do you want
me
to play my bongo drums?
Yes. Would you please begin the percussion part of our smooth jazz?
I'll
get ready to play.
All right.
Now,
get ready to rumble. Get ready to rumble. Here it goes.
Oh, so elegant. Sing along with Fly Me to the Moon.
If I sang, I would scare everybody away.
You can fly me to the moon. Is that enough fun?
You guys are great.
I think I take the points there.
That's
oh,
be
yes,
number
you
one
do.
on the hits list.
You do. You're just a remarkable fellow.
Oh, that was fun. That was fun.
That was fun.
Redefine Living
Now,
says he thinks that's Frank Sinatra.
Yes, it is. Old Frank Sinatra saw "Fly Me to the Moon." We will be touring the world, but we have to go back now and calm down and introduce our audience to what we're going to do. I'm going to give a 5-minute introduction to Charles Darwin and geology. And there's really some remarkable things about Darwin that many people do not know. My partner in crime, Brother George, is the world's greatest screen sharer. And he is
very talented.
He's developed some great graphics to introduce us to Darwin and the voyage. But let me begin with moving my body so that you can read the proverb behind me. Mrs. McQueen is actually going to put this on a pillow for me. Notice what it says. You can have your own opinion. And I'm thankful we live in free societies where we can have our own opinion. But you cannot have your own truth. You see it there? And so we have to ask ourselves, how much of this phenomenally boring book is opinion and how much of it is truth? Let us begin with the title of the book. If you've been to university or if you have been looking at the creation evolution debate, you will find people saying, well, we're going to quote from the Origin. They never give you the full title of the book. The book was published in 1859. Why was it not published in 1849? Well, Charles Darwin's wife, who was also his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood Darwin, was a very prominent member of the Unitarian Church. There was none in the little village they lived in, so she went to the Church of England, and she knew that her buddies in the sewing circle would come apart if they knew that Darwin believed that man origin could be described, proven outside of the book of Genesis. And she especially must have come apart over this title. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. We're going to suggest that natural selection was Darwin's God, and we may have to come back to that another day. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. What? Races? Was Darwin a racist? The German translation, my second language is German from high school and college, preservation of favored races in their Kampf, Verleben, Kampf. Now, does that ring a bell with you? What famous book had the word Kampf in it? Yes. Hitler's Mein Kampf, written in the 20s. I wonder why he chose that particular German word, which matches the translation of Darwin. Tonight's topic is over my other shoulder here. What did Charles Darwin think about the Earth? The cross-section that you see behind me is what we now know through geophysics is the core, the mantle, and the crust. Darwin didn't understand any of that Darwin, as has been pointed out for years, didn't understand the cell. In the crude microscope he had, he probably saw the nucleus and maybe the rest, but he had no idea about Golgi bodies, no details. We're going to suggest that Darwin actually had no full appreciation of geology, although there is some remarkable details about how Darwin ended up on Captain Fitzroy's ship called the Beagle. And I will save some of that for the second hour. Just let me introduce you to two words that Darwin used when he went to the field with the Reverend Pastor, Professor Adam Sedgwick, who lived from 1785 to 1873. Professor Sedgwick always took his class to Wales to see the Cambrian fossils there. He took Darwin there. I never knew he went with Darwin, but he taught Darwin how to tell the difference between a limestone and a shale and a granite. And he also taught him the old German division of Earth history. In German, it's the Urgebirge, which means the primitive rocks, or what we would call granites or greywackies. And then as you go above that in Wales and other places, the old Germans called it Übergangsgebirge. In other words, a transition zone, what Tim Clary would call the Salk sequence in sequence stratigraphy. So here we go, a little bit of German, a little bit of jazz, and I'll turn it over to my bongo playing buddy to give us his introduction to screen sharing and Charles Darwin.
Thanks, David. That Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I've got that book, a very thick book, by the way. So I'm going to share my screen and just add to what the good professor just said. Yep, that's the one I've got.
Yes, it is. How many pages? 1,200 pages.
Just bear with me 1 second.
Here we go, George. Okay. It's your moment to shine.
Okay.
Doing what you do best, brother.
There
Take
we
your
go.
time.
I'm just going to reinforce what David was saying. You'll hear today how evolutionists really have a dig at people with qualifications. Well, look at this. It says, Charles Darwin, English scientist. What degree in science did he have? None. Now, he used the fossils. Yeah, zero. He used the fossils to shape ideas about evolution, and he suspected species change or evolution over time. Now, just to expand what David was saying, you know, he joined a voyage. I think his father sent him on a voyage on the Beagle. He was born in February 12, 1809. I was born on February 8. No sort of homology there. Okay. He joined the crew of the HMS Beagle in 1831. He's considered a naturalist. He spent 5 years on that voyage around the world, or the world as they knew it at the time. He was an avid collector of flora and fauna and astounded by variety of life. Okay, now he was influenced quite a bit by Lyell and the book that he wrote on the principles of geology. And there you see today Charles Darwin in universities, etc., he's revered as a god, a religion. And as David was saying, you'll find in pretty much every modern book, the face cover of the book will say on the origin of species by means of natural selection. But as David pointed out, if you flip it over and you'll find the real title of the book, it says, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Here's a quote from Charles Darwin's notebook himself. He says, I, as a geologist, have a defined notion of land covered with oceans, farm animals, and slow force cracking the surface. What geologist is he? Did he have a degree in geology? But he calls himself a geologist. That's the trip that he took. He began from England over to South America, down to Cape Horn, sorry for that, across fairly close to the Central America, and then across over to New Zealand, Australia, back to Africa, back to South America, and to England to finish off his trip. Now, apparently, Lyell and Darwin became the best of friends. They were in a club, the Best Friends Club. I've got a short summary which I read a couple of days ago. It's an article in Scientific American. I'll stop sharing, but I'll go back to it a little bit later. So I'll just read from that. Just bear with me. Okay. Darwin became strongly influenced by the slow-occurring geology as proposed by Lyell, as I mentioned previously. He applied those principles formulated by Lyell and became convinced that the surface of the Earth changes over time only slowly and gradually. He encountered geology in the form of lectures by mineralogist Professor Robert Jamieson. Now listen to this. Darwin considered the teaching of Jamieson boring, and despite his ambitions in collecting minerals in early years, during his remaining time at university, he never again actively joined a lecture about geology. Okay, so during that particular voyage, 1831 to 1836, as I said, Darwin encountered various outcrops with magmatic and volcanic products, and he soon became fascinated by these rocks. It's specifically the geology of the Andes, I think the coral reefs, and his major contributions to volcanology are in two books that he wrote. Imagine that, eh? A non-geologist writing books on geology, The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs. That was published in 1842, and the Geological Observations of Volcanic Islands, published in 1844. Imagine if someone was to do that today. You'll find that article titled "Darwin, the Geologist," in a Scientific American magazine. Now, I was asked by Professor McQueen to point out the problems with his theory. Apparently, there are 4 problems, and I won't expand on those at the moment, but we will expand on them later on. Professor McQueen mentioned racism. Yes, that's one of the topics I want to raise, racism. The other one is geology and biology, but we'll expand on those as we go through our presentation. So in terms of the problems with his theory, number one was, why, if species have descended from other species by fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transition forms? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being as we see them well defined?
Yes.
Well, they're his words, not mine, okay? So he goes on to say, if my theory be true, numberless intermediate varieties linking closely together all the species of the same group, consequently evidence of their former existence could be found only among fossil remains. And I'm sure we're going to go through that a little bit later. Number 2, is it possible that an animal having, for instance, the structure of habits of a bat could have been formed by the modification of some other animal with widely different habitats and structures? I've got a few examples I'll show you later on that one. Number 3, can instincts be acquired and modified through natural selection? Number 4, how can we account for species when crossed and being sterile and producing sterile offspring, whereas when varieties are crossed, the fertility is unimpaired. Now, they're the four problems that he's put in for his theory. Now, if you like, I can take racism, if you like, Professor McQueen.
Well, let's do this. We do want to go to that because that's an important detail. We're 22 minutes into the talk now, so let me make 10 minutes worth of comments.
Okay.
We will take the first question at the 30-minute break, and then you present your comments about racism, and I will present mine after a couple of questions. Okay, George?
Okay.
So let me give a 10-minute presentation myself. You have to understand that Darwin's dad wanted him to become a medical doctor or an attorney. And so Darwin was sent to the University of Edinburgh, that Scottish university. Ms. McQueen and I visited Edinburgh to find our roots. She is Clan MacDonald. And we went to Edinburgh and walked by the university. He was there 100 years before the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee was 1925. And Darwin began at Edinburgh in 1825. And he stayed there only 2 years. I wonder why. Well, Darwin was a lazy student, so that his dad expected him to go to the university to learn about bones. Can you see my t-shirt? About rib bones and sternums and clavicles and so forth. But what did Darwin do? He went on long walks in the woods. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be reading more from my favorite part of Origin of Species, the part that really will wake you up, which is the last paragraph of the last chapter. I'm just going to read a little bit of it so you can understand how this man ended a 450-page book. He said, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank." So, George, imagine that you're walking along some Australian creek, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling up through the damp earth. And then you reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, what, Charles? Elaborately? This is intelligent design. This is elaborately, okay, Charles, let's keep going. You reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other. Wait, they're so different? They seem to be kinds, so different from each other and dependent on each other in a complex manner, have all been produced by God? No, that's what he thought initially. What does he say? They have all been produced by laws acting around us. Can you see that natural selection is Darwin's God to drive the evolution of man? This is in every textbook someplace. You've got from chimp to ape to Neanderthal to man, Homo sapiens, and so forth. He believed that this kind of transition could be observed. But why did I read about the trees and the shrubs? Because Darwin was more interested in this. George, this is a field guide to trees that I got 51 years ago. It's by some very well-known people. And the kind of stuff that's in it, when I took botany, you know, you can go and you can key out. Can you see that those are shrubs with composite compound leaves? This is what Darwin enjoyed. He'd walk around the woods of Scotland looking at worms and looking at plants. He didn't study the medical side of what a rib is and a sternum and so forth. And so, although the word was not used in 1825, the man flunked out. He couldn't be a medical doctor. Why? Because he was out wandering the woods, keying stuff out. And so he went back home to Daddy, and Dad said, listen, I mean, this is what I would say if he was my son. Listen, you worthless student, you got to do something. Oh, I know. I'll send you back to Edinburgh so that you can become a country pastor. You can become a priest within the Episcopalian Church, the Church of England, and you can have a small parish, and you can finally be successful. So, as George pointed out, what is Darwin's only earned degree? It's not in geology; it's in theology. He read Paley. He read the Bible. As a matter of fact, Fitzroy, when he was looking for someone to be on the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy was a creationist. He wanted somebody to come with him that would be able to prove in South America and Eastern Australia that the Great Flood occurred. So he chose Darwin. He had his resume. He wasn't a geologist. He had his resume, and he was a pastor. And so his only earned degree was in theology. But it actually gets either better or worse as you think about it. I have so much been encouraged by George and his research. I did some research on my own, and it turns out, let me get my world map here. It turns out that on the voyage of the Beagle, as they went around South America, they came into South America around Brazil there, and then went around, let me get my other hand going here, to the Galapagos Islands, where he made so many observations. Well, it turns out that the Reverend Dr. Adam Sedgwick, who was a professor, also a preacher, helped him to identify limestone, sandstone, shales, igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rock. And here's something, George, I didn't know. See if you know this. One of the first geologic maps of South America were made by none other than Charles Darwin himself. Now, he only went a few miles inland as he went all the way down the east coast and up the west coast of South America. But nonetheless, he wrote down in his journal where the limestones and shales were. Is that a detail you had known, Standing for Truth and George?
Yes, I do. Because it did some geology studies in South America, as I said, the Andes. So,
yeah. And next hour we'll come to his coral reef idea. But Standing for Truth, you want to go ahead and give us our first question, and we can go from there.
Definitely. Great presentation, gentlemen. I love all the work and research you put into this. And specifically, this topic is incredibly important. So great first 30 minutes, gentlemen. So first question here is, Professor McQueen, critics still claim fossilized footprints in the Grand Canyon are a problem for the global flood model. Or in other words, let me see here. It came in a couple times, actually. And it's also asked this way, that the skeptics ask, how can an animal that was supposed to be killed by a flood leave footprints in a flood layer after the fact?
Okay. With Ms. McQueen's help, she kneaded this Play-Doh for me, which I stole without apology since I bought it with my money from my grandchildren. So we'll use this to answer that. And I appreciate that question because it's an important question. If you want to look at this in great detail, go online and Google my former colleague at ICR, Dr. Steve Austin, and he's got a number of books that he's written about the geology of the Grand Canyon. The fossil footprints of reptiles and amphibians are found high in the canyon in a group of rocks, sandstones called the Coconino Sandstone, which is a very extensive layer of rock all through the American Southwest. Okay, so here's the flood geology explanation of that I've used for years. So at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we have the green rocks that would be called the green rocks, which would be called Creation Week rocks. The old German geologists that Darwin studied called these the Urgebirge, or the primitive rocks. There are no fossils in them. And then on top of that, you have, actually, I want to save that. No, we'll do it. I hope you can see the blue there. The blue rocks are the rocks of the beginning of the flood. In the Grand Canyon, this is the Tapete Sandstone going up through the Red Wall Limestone. And these are what the old German geologists would call Übergangsgebirge. In other words, transitional. The words that Dr. Henry Morris used in the 50s is we've got primary rocks, secondary rocks, tertiary rocks, and quaternary. So in Europe, in America, there are these four divisions. What I call Creation Week, Flood Year, Post-Flood, and then I have another division that we've talked about, post-flood, residual catastrophe, and so forth. But let's go back to the point of the question. So as you hike down the Grand Canyon, which I've done 5 times in 4 years, we would stop at the Coconino Sandstone, and on many of the trails, you can find footprints. And so here we've got these reptiles that are running away from the rising floodwaters. George, can you see the footprints of the little beasts there?
I certainly do, yep.
Okay, so they're running away. An hour later, another wave of the flood comes through and washes the wee beasties, the amphibians, the reptiles, wash them away. You don't find the bones with these footprints. You just find the footprints. Mm-hmm. Okay. As I have walked with my grandchildren on the beaches in South Mississippi, northern Florida, along the Caribbean Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, I'll teach them this. We'll make footprints. There's the footprint of my grandson, Ian, who's now 13. But in the old days, he would walk with me without looking down at his tablet and cell phone, but I won't get into that. And so we'd walk along the beach, and he would leave his footprints. And I would say, Ian, turn around. And then 2 waves would come in and wash the footprints away. And so I would say to him, how could these footprints then be preserved? Well, they're preserved when the next wave of Noah's flood came in very quickly and buried these things. My partner in crime, George, is fond of using the phrase, oh, they've shot themselves in the foot.
Yes.
Well, this is the foot of those reptiles and amphibians. And for them to argue that slow processes over hundreds of years, thousands of years, could have preserved these, my grandfather, McQueen, had words for that are inappropriate. I can't say the words he had, but that's not a correct idea. That is, just a silly idea. The next wave came in, so you see the orange on top of the red there, and preserved these. The only way a dinosaur footprint can be preserved, the only way that these reptile and amphibian footprints can be preserved is in a catastrophic model like flood geology. Comments, George, on that?
You're quite right. Also, the subsequent layer or wave that would have come through would have had suspended particles in it, almost a sludge, if you like, filling those footprints. So it's not if it's just water washing over those previously imprints, because as you mentioned, Professor McQueen, if they were the products of millions of years of deposition, and we covered this with cell geodina, where the explanation, the secular explanation is deposition occurs at about 1 millimeter per 1,000 years, I believe, standing. I can't remember now, but when you compare that with the actual erosion rates, secular erosion rates of 6 centimeters per year, it just doesn't add up.
Right.
Those footprints should not be there.
And let's always circle back to the Bible. And today's passage, if you want to follow along, is 2 Peter chapter 1:16. I sure wish I knew someone that understood the Greek of the New Testament, because we want to focus on a certain word that has a very interesting meaning in Greek, but I'll read it in English in the King James. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So our argument at Standing for Truth is the Bible is an eyewitness account of what occurred 6,000 years ago. But notice this phrase, George, cunningly devised fables. As I studied this, I found out that this word, fable, is the Greek word mythos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's the word myth. And so our argument to the Standing for Truth class, as George and I think about it, or audience, is that the idea depicted by this photograph of the evolution from chimpanzee to ape to man is a fable. It's a modern philosophical fable. We must always be reminded that ideas have power and ideas have consequences. Amen. After the 1 hour break, we're going to build on what George is we're going to take one more question, and then George is going to finish out the hour talking about the racism included in Origin of Species. I do want to make one point, and we'll check this over the break. I think that your first graphic had Darwin dying in 1892. I think he actually died in 1882. Now, why in the world would I know that? It turns out my grandfather, H.H. McQueen, was born in 1883. So that's my link to Darwin. He died the year before my grandfather was born. That's not that long ago. Okay, one more question, Standing for Truth, and then we'll go to George's presentation on racism.
Sure. Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. Very detailed, Professor McQueen. I think we might even make that into just a separate clip. Oftentimes we'll make shorter clips out of longer videos, especially because that's so common from the critic. Now, I've heard them, I guess just to leave no stone unturned before we go to the break, I've heard them say it this way, Professor McQueen, and there are people in the audience that are just curious as to your thoughts. What they say regarding the preserved footprints is that there are preserved footprints and tail marks that vertebrates made while walking over wet sand dunes. So they'll ask, how could these have formed and been preserved in the middle of a chaotic worldwide flood? Is that something that is a valid criticism in your opinion?
Yeah, and not really for this reason. Let's use here we go. Here's a map of the United States, and you'll see down at the bottom the state. Let me put my finger on Louisiana here. It's going to be here someplace. There's Louisiana, and then Texas is to the west, and here is Florida, the peninsula of Florida. It's so hard to do this. There we go. There's the peninsula of Florida. Now, how does this help us to understand it? We have spoken previously about floating mats of plant debris that ended up incorporated in the rock record as coal measures. If you're outside the United States, these are called the Carboniferous deposits. If you've been taught geology in the United States, it's Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian even, coal measures. So again, back to the Play-Doh. Let's use my hat here as an area in Texas, South Texas, called the Llano Uplift, which is a uplift of granite that occurred during the time of the flood, according to Dr. Snelling. And so you have a floating mat the size of Florida. That's the reason I showed you the map. A floating mat the size of Louisiana. So think about this. For me to drive to the state capitol is a 5-hour drive. So imagine a group of humans, which we'll illustrate here by this. So here's a group of humans standing a 5-hour drive, hundreds of miles away from a group of dinosaurs. So we'll take the cap off and we'll let this be the dinosaurs hundreds of miles away. This thing goes up against the Llano Uplift. The dinosaurs scamper off into micrite muds of the Glen Rose Formation found in the Paluxy River south of Dallas. They scamper off. Maybe a few hours later, maybe a day later, the humans walk over the same area and they leave human footprints along with dinosaur footprints. We'll save that discussion for another day. Let's go to point here, George. The point is, once these dinosaurs get off, they're washed away by the next wave, and the micrite mud precipitates out of the floodwaters and fills in the track. And so the geochemical, the carbonate petrology, the microstratigraphy of flood geology provides a perfectly adequate explanation for dinosaur footprints and tail drags when you do not find the dinosaur bones themselves. What do you think, George?
Great answer.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah,
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I think Nephilim Free hit the nail on the head. His comment says if ancient Greek and Roman stone buildings can erode so that their edges are rounded in 2,500 years or less, then no fossil footprint will exist in 1 million years unless it is quickly buried in sediments. This is what we keep saying. Fossilization is a process. It requires quick burial through deep sedimentation. And that's the only way it can happen.
Before we come to the fact that Darwin saw fossils in southern South America, George, go ahead and take the last 10 minutes here and give your presentation on racism. When we come back from the 1-hour break, I want everybody to go get their high school copy of Macbeth, being of Scottish descent. We're going to talk about Macbeth and Darwin, but we'll save that for after the break. George, I turn it over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Macbeth was one of our, curriculum, part of the curriculum in, I think it was fifth form in high school. So we actually went through it verse by verse, pretty much from front to back.
Oh, yeah. Well, then you will recall, we'll read the whole Act 1, Scene 1 in a minute, but you'll recall that thunder and lightning brings in the 3 witches. You can think of them as standing for truth, George and me, the 3 witches. And the first witch says, I'll be the first witch. When shall we three meet again? And then what's the next line? You probably have it memorized, George.
Oh,
When
come
shall
on.
we meet again? In thunder, lightning, or rain. We'll save the rest of that for after the break. Go ahead, George.
It's interesting the quote you've got behind you, and David, because I was listening to an after show a day or so ago where someone mentioned there are three truths. There's the empirical truth, the personal truth, and the political truth.
No, please, let's don't get started on world politics. Oh no!
But that got me started on all this, all the BS that's going on around the world with racism and how we should be tearing down statues, etc.
Mm.
But I find it a very hypocritical sort of argument because just as recently, I think as last month or this month, get a load of this, the Sheffield University told its staff that Charles Darwin was a racist and used natural selection theory to justify white male superiority in a decolonizing curriculum lecturing handbook. This is from the Sheffield University. Now, if they can be such hypocrites that they can be tearing down any statue where that specific person was somehow related to slavery or some kind of racist act, why do we still see all these? Exactly, why do we still see these statues of Darwin in universities? It just doesn't make sense. I'm going to quote a few.
I agree.
I'm going to quote a few quotes here, and from quite well-known people who really shouldn't be well-known, but Eric Harris, the Columbine killer, he said, "Natural selection needs a boost, like me with the shotgun." And this I found very astounding by Richard Dawkins. He says, "What's to prevent us from saying Hitler wasn't right?" I mean, that is a genuinely difficult question. How can that be a genuinely difficult question?
Yeah, let me interrupt you. Did you just say that the Columbine shooter said that?
Yes, he said natural selection needs a boost,
now this is
like
important
me with a shotgun.
Yeah, this is an important detail. Columbine's tragedy occurred on Führertag, April 20th. That's Hitler's birthday. Go on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is from Charles Darwin himself. He says, "It is very true that you say about the higher races of men. When high enough, replacing and clearing off the lower races. In 500 years," he says, "how the Anglo-Saxon race will have spread and exterminated whole nations, and in consequence, how much the human race, viewed as a unit, will have risen in rank." Charles Darwin in a letter 3439 to Kingsley on the 6th of February 1862. Now we're going to see how Darwin actually influenced so many people. I won't read all the quotes because I think most of you are aware of it, but Darwin actually says, "Consequences of one general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest died." Now, do you think Hitler didn't take note of this particular fact that Darwin mentioned in his book? This was the basis for Darwin's racist statements in his subsequent book, The Descent of Man, and it influenced so many generations to commit genocide and mass murder.
Yeah,
there are so many other quotes I can actually cite, but this one's from Ernst Haeckel. I think everyone knows him as Darwin's bulldog, I believe. He actually said, "These lower races, such as the Veddars or Australian Negroes, are psychologically nearer to the mammals, that is, the apes or dogs, than to civilized European. We must therefore assign a totally different value to their lives. That is as racist as you can get. Francis Galton said the creed of eugenics is founded upon the idea of evolution. Stalin
Let me
said,
interrupt to comment about this. Charles Darwin argued for the evolution of old white men like himself as the apex of the Aryan race. He thought that Negroes and Jews, well, Hitler, let me try to be more clear. Darwin certainly believed that the people of South America, the Aboriginals, were a lower race, to use his word. And then Hitler built on that, just like you said, and said, oh, we can measure the noses of Jews and we can use Nazi racial science to prove they're not even human. Go ahead, George.
Well, Stalin, in a conversation with Soso, said, I'm quoting here, they are fooling us. There is no God. I was astounded at these words. I had never heard anything like it before. How can you say such things, Soso? I exclaimed, I'll lend you a book to read. It will show you that the world and all living things are quite different from what you imagine. And all this talk about God is sheer nonsense, Joseph said. What book is that? I inquired. Darwin, you must read it, okay? How many people did Stalin murder? 12, 15 million?
More than Hitler.
Yes. And here's one from Margaret Sanger, the person who actually, I think, founded Parenthood.
Planned Parenthood, yes.
Yes, Planned Parenthood. So she says, before eugenists and others who are labouring for racial betterment can succeed, they must first clear the way for birth control. Like the advocates of birth control, the eugenists, for instance, are seeking to assist the race towards the elimination of the unfit. Both are seeking a single end, but they lay emphasis upon different methods. That's Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, now, forgive the interruption, George. I don't want the Standing for Truth audience to misunderstand what I'm saying about old white men and African Americans and Jews. Keep in mind that when my great-grandfather came over from Scotland, when other Irish guys came over after the Great Potato Famine to New York and so forth, the very rich, very European, very British aristocracy in the northeastern part of the United States considered my great-grandfather as subhuman, the Irish as subhuman. And so don't think that George and I are picking on Aboriginals and African Americans or Negroes in the vocabulary of Darwin. It's very extensive, isn't it, George?
Oh yeah, I mean even the Slavs. I think the Balkan people were considered a race of people that Hitler was going to exterminate after the Jews. Now, it's interesting. It's interesting, David. You mentioned the rise and fall of the Third Reich. In that book, you'll find Rudolf Hess, a very important figure in the Nazi Party and the ideology of what the Nazis actually stood for. Now, he actually said this: National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. Get that? Applied biology. Many people I've heard cite that Hitler was a Catholic. Somehow he was religious and therefore he couldn't have held these views. I'm sorry, but he actually says, this is Adolf Hitler says, if nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such a case, all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. That is Darwinism to the T.
And
Okay?
let me read from page 110 of my 50th anniversary edition of this remarkable book by Shirer, my dad's favorite book, I might add. Notice what he says here. He's quoting Nietzsche, and Hitler says this: the strong men, the masters, regain the pure conscience of a beast of prey, monsters filled with joy. Now, George, think of the SS. Think of the Einsatzgruppen that went to get the Jews out of Poland. They can return from a fearful succession of murder, arson, rape, torture with the same joy in their hands that some have when all they're doing is reading a student magazine at the university.
Yep.
That's remarkable, isn't it?
And that's where they target the young nowadays, in the universities. That's where all these so-called progressives, they target the students in that particular area. And in some cases now you'll find they even go lower than that in high schools, primary schools, and even kindergartens, believe it or not. When they first read stories to the children in the kindergartens, they say millions of years ago. That is brainwashing right there.
Oh, yes. And one thing we need to keep in mind, Standing for Truth audience, as you listen to this, is that the issues that we're bringing up here are foundational when we talk about the place of the Bible in our thinking. The Ten Commandments clearly teach that thou shalt not murder people. And the fact that in the 1920s, the ordinary German student was taught that evolution was true, that somehow you could determine that one group or one race of people are above another race. And so if you can prove that the Jews are subhuman, if you can prove that gypsies are subhuman, if you can prove that the Slavs are subhuman, then forget about what the Bible says about thou shalt not murder. Let's go out and one of the most frightening statistics I've ever learned is that Hitler almost succeeded. In the concentration camps, he was able to destroy 2/3 of all Eastern European Jews. Think in terms of Poland. George?
I totally agree, David. We've hit the 1 hour mark. Do you want to take your 5-minute break?
Please, I have to get some more coffee, put a jazz record on. I got to do something to get Darwin out of my mind. I'll be back in 5 minutes if you'll drop my video.
Awesome.
No worries.
See you in a bit, Professor McQueen. And George, real quick before you go,
Yep.
I am going to take a 30-second break myself, as I have been downing coconut water and coffee here at the same time. So I shall be back in 30 seconds to a minute, George, and then we can go over a few things before Professor McQueen comes back, if that works for you, brother.
No problem. I think it's a good opportunity for the audience to take a leave to the restroom if you want to, and come back in 30 seconds to a minute. Just a little bit of small talk. I recall buying the book Origin of the Species. I think when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I bought it at a secondhand bookshop for 40 cents. And believe me, I found it boring back then as well. And I purchased the latest one that I showed previously from Kindle, and it was $1, just $1 from Kindle. Play some music. All right, I'll find that bongo drum clip again, because I kind of like bongo drums.
You've got a solid career ahead of you, George, in music, because
I had a request.
Oh, you did? Yes.
Yeah.
Somebody says, "Who's playing ping pong?" It did kind of sound like you were training for your next big ping pong tournament, brother.
It sounds like a ping pong, because what you do when you play bongo drums, you can either hit them in the middle of the drum or to the edges. If you hit them at the edges, it sounds like a ping pong.
I like it. So, anyways, before Professor McQueen comes back, the debate from last night is getting a lot of good feedback, guys. So thanks for the support. If you have not yet seen it, please check it out. I think it was a really good debate on human evolution versus independent origins. And Jackson Rowe, he was cordial and respectful, but at the same time, he has a channel dedicated to, attempting to refute young Earth creation. So he's made videos against a number of us, and therefore, a lot of the times, those are the best debates, where you get the critics into the ring and see if they can back up what they've been saying in their videos or over on their channel. So definitely check out that debate, guys. And I went over some reminders in the opening, but a lot of people weren't here that are here now. So tomorrow we've got CJ, who was in the chat, brother CJ right here, the synagogue. He'll be here tomorrow debating the Canadian atheist, I believe is his name, on the 10 Commandments. But George, any reminders from yourself? I know we've got a ton of shows planned as well. We've got the entire creation research team joining us at the end of the month for a talk on races. Any reminders from you, George? What are your thoughts, brother?
You've got me booked so many presentations. I've lost track. I gotta keep a diary. But I was actually gonna add to your debate last night, because I was reading an article, and this is how recent it is. Okay, it was dated May the 6th, 2021, from phys.org. I'm just going to quote you a couple of small paragraphs. It says, intriguingly, such narratives have not drastically changed since Darwin. We must be aware of confirmation biases and ad hoc interpretations by researchers aiming to confer the new fossil for starring role within a pre-existing narrative. Did you get a load of that, guys?
Yeah.
Their new fossil with a pre-existing narrative. Then it goes on to say, evolutionary scenarios are appealing because they provide plausible explanations based on current knowledge, but unless grounded in testable hypotheses, they are no more than just stories. It says, overall, the researchers found that most stories of human origins are not compatible with the fossils that we have today. And I was amazed that Jackson Rowe used those fossils, those hominid fossils, to argue the point of evolution when you get the American Museum of Natural History said that what I just quoted was directly from the American Museum of Natural History.
Yeah, very good point, George. And
Very good.
I want to use my saxophone the way that I do when I teach intelligent design, and the problem of Mr. and Mrs. Lucy Australopithecines finding themselves in the Olduvai Gorge. Can't just have the evolution of a man. You've got, I'm sorry, a male. You got to have the evolution of a female too. So over the last 3 years, I've been able to substitute teach. George, I hope you don't find this shocking. Between kindergarten and the senior level of high school, 12th year here in Louisiana. And I'll often take my saxophone in to entertain the children and to annoy the leadership of the local church, of the local schools. Just a little humor there. But when I go in, I will say, this is an alto saxophone. It was developed by Adolf Sax in Europe, and there's a family of saxophones. There is a alto saxophone. There's an even bigger tenor saxophone, a bigger baritone saxophone, and the biggest bass saxophone. And it goes all the way down to the Kenny G soprano saxophone. So there's a family of these things. So let's imagine the evolution of the saxophone. Okay, you got 3 parts to a saxophone. Basically, you got a mouthpiece that has the reed on it there. And so somewhere in the Olduvai Gorge of saxophone world, this mouthpiece has to evolve. But it's not good enough to have a mouthpiece. Better put it where I don't drop it here. Every saxophone has what's called a neck. And so here's the neck of the alto saxophone. Every saxophone's got to have that. And then you have to have a body. And look at the complexity of the keys and the vowels and the bell. It looks like intelligent design to me, but don't miss my point. If you're going to evolve the family of saxophones to match the family of evolution, you got to keep a couple of things in mind. If you had Neanderthal man in downtown Sydney or in one of the provincial capitals in Canada or here in America, and you put a hat on Neanderthal man and walked him down the street, nobody would ever, they wouldn't even comment. You know, he's got a brow ridge and all the rest. But it turns out that now he's known to be Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So you've got to have all the parts evolving at the same time. And that's why you simply cannot imagine human evolution. Okay, let's go back to our theme of Darwin and geology. Is that okay, George?
Well, I was actually going to cover biology quickly, and then we can go into geology.
Okay, please do.
All right, Standing, can I share the screen, please?
Of course, Brother George. Whenever you're ready, I will share that screen for you. And there it is. George, you are a pro now. Go ahead.
Okay. In The Origin of Species, Darwin said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can't find out no such case. Okay, well, I don't know if you people have heard of the MO1 bacteria, but there it is there. It has, the bacteria uses a system of 7 tails. Get a load of that, 7 tails that rotate in one direction, while 24 smaller gears arranged in a hexagonal pattern are synchronized to rotate in the opposite direction. This is an obvious design. It prevents the tails entangling while providing maximum thrust with minimum friction, giving it the ability to swim 10 times faster than other bacteria. Now, this is interesting. The 7-motor, 24-gear mechanism is simpler but far more complex than modern aircraft, helicopters, and jumbo jets that only use 2 to 4 engines. The bacterium has nearly the same number of parts as a Boeing 747, that is 6 million, that allows the bacterium to do something the 747 can't do. Multiply itself. Imagine that, the oldest single cell bacteria having that kind of irreducible complexity. And I call it the oldest because even the secular literature says the MO1 bacteria has an uncanny complexity, which, while claimed to be the earliest single cell at 3 billion years old.
Oh boy! Oh boy!
Oh boy! Yeah. Now the other one is, who's ever seen this? The monarch butterfly. All right. Now, can any evolutionist tell me how the caterpillar went to the butterfly? They always cite a Wikipedia article that really only talks about metamorphosis. I don't want to know about the process of metamorphosis. We know what that is. We want to know the gradual progression of the evolution of the caterpillar to the butterfly.
Exactly.
Amen.
Now, this is a great summary, right? The caterpillar literally turns into a soup in its cocoon. It completely rearranges its DNA to go from no wings to wings, from 12 legs to 6 legs, 13-segment body to 10-segment body, 6 simple eyes to 2 compound eyes, comprising of 12,000 segments, no sex organs to having sex organs, chewing jaws to a coiled sucking tube, and as I mentioned, the 12,000 eye segments can see with a 360-degree view. Explain that, evolutionists. I keep asking this question during the debates, and no one really has provided an explanation except point me to Wikipedia. Wikipedia doesn't explain it.
Yeah, now let's keep in mind that as Darwin wandered the woods of Scotland, and certainly back in southern England, he was a big butterfly collector and insects. He loved that kind of stuff. And so Darwin, when he was studying the Bible, when he got his degree in theology, he actually was a creationist. He believed that God created that. Standing for Truth, remind me to answer this question. I see it in the chat about the Grand Canyon Supergroup.
Yeah.
Let me come back to that and remind me of that. But on to George's point here about the biological side of Darwin's argument, I hope you're aware that the Institute for Creation Research has a new president, and the man is got a remarkable resume. Galuza is his name. He is a medical doctor. He's got a PE degree, which means professional engineer, and he's initiated a biological equivalent of the rate group. The rate group is, recall, the one that goes back to the year 2000 that worked on radiometric dating and so forth. Well, now he's going to go from now through the next 5 or 10 years in the biological equivalent of replacing the vocabulary of natural selection. Mm-hmm. My colleagues in creationism say when you read natural selection in Darwin's book, just go ahead and substitute the word orange Play-Doh, because this is Darwin's God. This is what's supposed to drive this level of evolution. And as we will see in a few minutes here, when we actually read from Darwin's chapter, which is entitled, this is chapter 6, difficulties of the theory, you'll find Darwin saying this: long before having arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to the reader. Some of them are so grave that I can never reflect on them without being staggered. But to the best of my judgment, the greater number are not only apparent, whether they're real or not, I think they're fatal to my theory. How many times did you hear that in college, George, being read from the Bible of evolution?
Yeah. I got a couple more points before we get to the geology part, David.
Yes, please.
One of his quotes, again from his book, is if it could be proven, if it could be proved that any part of the structure of any one species had been formed for the exclusive good of another species, it would annihilate my theory, for such could not have been produced through natural selection. My comments to that is, I wonder if Darwin knew about the bacteria in our gut and what benefit that bacteria has, and the various microorganisms in our bloodstream and tissues. And now we're finding all these molecular motors in our DNA that are so small and intricate that smacks of design. There's no way they're going to convince us that those things happen by natural causes.
Our students, remember my colleague George is a professional engineer. He's actually taken classes in mechanical engineering. And I don't think that he and his buddies, given a whole afternoon, could create a complicated gear and axle design like he presented in that bacteria. Right, George?
Well, that's correct. That's why engineers recognize design. They definitely, like I showed in that MO1 bacteria, the 24 interconnecting gears. How can you possibly imagine that occurring through a natural process, a random natural process, by the way? And by the way, David, I looked at that saxophone, the evolution of the saxophone, and I had a good analogy in a discussion I was listening to last night where somebody suggested that the cell phones evolved. That proves evolution. However, there's two points to that.
How stupid.
They were both intelligently designed with foresight. Evolution doesn't have foresight. Evolution is a random mutational process. So how can he equate those two processes?
Evolution doesn't have a mind.
Exactly, doesn't have a mind.
It gets even better because I own an iPhone 6, and I know it goes back to Apple, and I just happen to have an apple here I've been eating, and it goes back to the Garden of Eden, goes all the way back to Satan. So I'm convinced the iPhone was created by Satan. It's a curse, but we won't do it.
That's good.
Just quickly to finish off the biology section, I'm just going to share a screen for a moment, Standing.
Nope, not allowed. You're only allowed 3 screen shares per show.
Oh, no.
You'll have to save it for next.
Play your bongos. Interrupted.
Here we go, George. You are shared.
Okay. Now, it's amazing reading the book that Darwin appeals to these laws. You see that? Laws. I'm just going to bold it and underline it, right? He says, grounded on the laws of geographic distribution, laws of variation, laws governing the sterility of hybrids, how singular the laws. He just goes on and quotes all these laws, but I'm sorry, but I can't find any of these laws. I think he was trying to add weight to his argument by quoting laws. I don't know whether they actually use the word law the way we use the word law today, though. But he doesn't mention the law of biogenesis, Now, that may have been because it was after his time, but I checked, and the law of biogenesis was a well-known fact back in those days. Anyway, the law of biogenesis, this is in Biology Online, says the principle stating that life arises from pre-existing life, not from non-living material. Many evolutionists will say there's no such law. Well, we say there is, and there's empirical evidence for it. Thousands of years of husbandry has proven that life only gives rise to life, never from non-life. Okay, so now we can go into the geology part, and I'm going to ask to share the screen later, Standing, but
No problem.
let's begin
Now-
the conversation now.
Okay.
On geology.
I want to read the last sentence of the last paragraph of the last chapter of Origin of Species. Listen to this in light of what George just said. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, the production of higher animals directly follows. Favored races. Now listen to this. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers. Having been, now he put the next part in because his wife was at least tangentially interested in the Bible. He put this in. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms. What, George? What, Charles? Having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone on cycling on according to the fixed, there's the word, George, fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Wait, you have to go to the last word in Origin of Species to finally find the word evolution. Let me reread this. This is remarkable. So he's claiming that natural selection is just like the law of gravity. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful. Let's explain beauty, by the way, within evolution. Most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved. See, Darwin expected that some sort of new kind of a breed between a dog and a cat would be formed. Let's think of what that would be. Let's see, DOG, so it'd be a cog, that's a cat part, and then a cat is CAT, so that'd be a dat. So he was expecting dats and cogs in the modern world, but we don't. We find just dogs and cats.
Well, you've just stole my thunder, David. That was one of my concluding passages.
Well, you can go back to it.
But
now, let me just make a quick comment.
Yeah.
Now, we ought to take some other question standing for truth other than the one about the Grand Canyon Supergroup. I want to put that off for a minute.
David, can I finish on that point, though?
Yes, please.
What you just read is exactly what theistic evolutionists believe.
Exactly.
Famine and death is not very good as God described his creation. Yet they believe that famine and death is what created evolution and how we became man. So
exactly.
I just wanted to finish on that point.
Yes.
Well, for the evolutionists, death is the hero of the story.
Yeah.
While for us, we know that death is the enemy that will be conquered.
Go ahead and give another question for us to address, and then I'll go into the geology some more about Darwin.
So we've got, okay, so I'll skip this supergroup one for now. And do you want to do, there's one here that the question is, this is a criticism made on a website at Biologos. They say, despite the claims of flood geologists, the rocks reveal multiple episodes of deposition and intervening periods of erosion. Is there any validity to this claim?
There certainly is. Let me go back to the Plato here as an example. And George, take out pen and paper. Let me teach you some new words here. If you have a group of rocks that have been tilted like this, and then you have other rocks formed on top of it, that's called an angular unconformity.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is in the Grand Canyon, you've got Cambrian to peat sandstone. And then at the top, you've got supposedly Mississippian red wall limestone. But what about carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl? Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian? There's Cambrian there for sure, but Silurian, carry out Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, very minor parts there. So the word that the evolutionary community uses, the old earth geologist uses, is a disconformity. And so when you pick up the layers of the Grand Canyon, there are enormous gaps where there's plenty of Cambrian. The Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian is mostly missing. And then you've got the red wall limestone, then above that, the coconino sandstone. These are called disconformities. And so the evolutionary community says that there must be multiple episodes of deposition and intervening periods of erosion. Oh, really? Well, when you look at the contacts in the Grand Canyon, the contact between the coconino sandstone and what's underneath it and what's above it is a knife edge contact. So our idea of this group of rocks being deposited in the first month of the flood worldwide, what's called the Salk sequence. And then as the flood proceeds, the next group, the blue group, is brought in and is deposited. See, that's a better explanation. You don't see any erosion between the two. Why? Because there wasn't any erosion. It was catastrophic wave over catastrophic wave. Now, does that not mean that there are places in Europe and in America and in Australia that you get on up in the rock record and you find angular unconformities? Yeah, you see that. But overall, the data of the Grand Canyon is the exact counter argument of this biologos stuff. You don't see the number of episodes of erosion that you would predict.
Just to add to that, David, in the Origins of Species, Darwin actually says some of these formations, which are represented in England by thin beds, are thousands of feet in thickness on the continent. Moreover, he says, between each successive formation, we have, in the opinion of most geologists, blank periods of enormous length.
That's true. And now, here's an important detail to keep in mind. Remember that the captain of the Beagle was a man named Fitzroy, who was a creationist. He hired Darwin because he had a degree in theology. During the voyage from England to South America, Darwin would actually argue with the sailors and say, oh, it's wrong to have a girl in every port because the Bible teaches that you should be true to your wives. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So in the early part of the voyage, Darwin argued that. Well, then he went below decks at night, and when he should have been reading his Bible, what did he read? Captain Fitzroy bought him a copy of Charles Lyell's Foundations of Geology, the first edition, and he gave it to Darwin as a gift. And so Darwin began reading this earth science book right alongside with the Bible, and as time went on, the earth science book became more important than the Bible. And Darwin began to think, well, I think I can see these erosional things that Lyell's talking about. I think I do see a problem with the White Cliffs of Dover. I think that it's not 6,000 years. Wouldn't this be a good episode to do in the summer, George, to track the history of what people thought the age of the earth was?
That would be awesome. I feel like we have, Professor McQueen, we could do this series for the next million years because there's so many good topics. And I got to say, Professor McQueen, your answers are phenomenal. And I love how detailed they are. And I want to say, I'm just glad that we're on the same team, and I can see why. I won't say any names, but I host and moderate a lot of debate. So I'm constantly reaching out to people. And I will say this, that there have been one specific geologist who's written a book refuting young earth creation. Now, I won't say any names, but he refused to debate with you. And I see why, because I wouldn't want to either.
We'll get some people on, but let's move on to the geology side of this. Where to begin? Let's begin with this. So 1825 to 1827 is when Darwin flunked out of med school at the University of Edinburgh, went back, finally got his degree, went on the voyage of the Beagle in the 1830s. So he gets off the voyage. He's got a ton of specimens, and he's found all these finches on the Galapagos Island. And he makes this enormous argument about if you got a beak like this, you have to evolve on this island. And I won't go into all that Galapagos stuff. But he did talk about coral reefs. And I want George to go to that part of his notes about what Darwin said about coral reefs. And let me give you an introduction to it. Over the last 50 years, many creationist geologists have said, wait, McQueen, wait, Austin, wait, all you guys. How can you explain these coral reefs that we find in the rock record? Let me use the orange here to be a coral reef. And so you go in the Western United States and you're going through Texas and you're going to New Mexico and all that. So you find this pile of rocks, and then in the middle of it, you find this orange coral reef. And they'll say, oh, Darwin showed how the coral reef must have been killed. And then in Darwin's thinking, 1,000 years later, another coral reef, the inflation of the Earth's age. Now they think there's like 10,000 years between these different layers of the coral. This has been an ongoing debate within creation science. And it was initiated actually by Charles Darwin. I'll let George introduce you to that. But the reason it's not a problem is this. A coral reef is an ecological zone in Noah's ocean. And so as the catastrophe of that first 40 days swept worldwide, it is no wonder that coral reefs of great thickness actually are buried in the rock record. They're buried catastrophically. Why do we know that? Remember that a geologist, and Darwin collected this in South America, a snail is called a gastropod, a clam is called a pelecypod. So these, let's switch these from rock records to two parts of a oyster. When a pelecypod or a clam is killed, it's got an upper shell and a lower shell held on by a muscle that opens and closes. That muscle, if you take your grandchildren to the beach as I have, is routinely gone. And so when you collect seashells at the seashore, say that real fast, George, trying to make him laugh, he's not even listening. When you collect these seashells, they're popped apart. Why? Because the wave action breaks that membrane down. How come above and below the corals, we find thick beds of pelecypods or clams that have closed shells? They have closed shells because they were catastrophically buried. George, you want to add to that, or do you have a screen to show about the coral reef argument from Darwin?
Yes. I was just a moment, David.
Okay, let me keep on going. What I have learned is that when
Okay, I'm ready.
when Darwin went to the field with Sedgwick, he really taught him a bunch about igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rocks. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I was going to go on with the coral reefs.
Please.
Excuse me. As I mentioned, I think earlier, Darwin actually did write about coral reefs after returning to England. I think you mentioned 1836. Darwin actually presented his first scientific discourse of the geology of the Andes at the Royal Geological Society, and he published some preliminary results about the volcanic phenomena observed in South America, etc. But he also wrote about the structure and formation of coral reefs around the slowly drowning volcanic islands in the Pacific.
Yes.
Now, notice he says the slowly, right? But modern science, modern empirical science, specifically with the Great Barrier Reef, and what they found was, and this is empirical science, right? They found that 1.8 meters of this coral has grown in the last 118 years. So when you equate that to per year, it equates to 15 millimeters per year, because coral grows like tree rings. So when you compare the coral of the Great Barrier Reef, it equates to less than 3,700 years old. So there's empirical science for you. It doesn't take millions of years for coral to form. So that's what I wanted to add in terms of the coral argument. But I've got some other things I want to bring up in terms of the geology. I just got to find my notes here. There's quite a bit. I mean, I'm not going to cover all of it because there's just too much to cover.
Yeah. While you're finding that, let me read a section from Darwin's chapter called "The Imperfection of the Geological Record." This is how he ends the paragraph. The several difficulties here discussed, namely our not finding in the successive formations infinitely numerous transitional links between the many species which now exist or have existed, that's a real problem. And he says the almost entire absence, as at present known, of fossiliferous formations beneath the Silurian strata, and he goes on.
Yeah,
Darwin really expected that in the 100 years from 1859 to 1959, that these transitional forms would be found, and they were not. George, back to you.
Yes, correct, David. He actually says, as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. He goes on to say, we surely ought to find at the present time many transitional forms, but then goes on to say the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. You see how he's concluding, based on his deep time, inconceivably great, yet they can't find any intermediate or transitional forms. And then he goes on to say, we can best gain some idea of past time by knowing the agencies at work and learning how deeply the surface of the land has been denuded and how much sediment has been deposited. And this is where I'd like to share the screen and actually show some modern empirical science.
Yeah.
So get ready, standing. My favorite part.
As you pull it up, I'll comment. Those of you that have had deductive logic in college, think about whether Darwin was using inductive logic or deductive logic. Go ahead, George.
Okay, there he goes. He said in his book, he says, it is good to wander along the coast when formed or moderately hard rocks and mark the process of degradation. He says the slow rate at which the land is worn away through subaerial and littoral action, it is good in order to appreciate the past duration of time, to consider, on the one hand, the masses of rock which have been removed over many extensive areas, and on the other hand, the thickness of our sedimentary formations. For those that aren't familiar with the word littoral, it's the actual coastal action, well, the wave action when it hits the coast. Okay, so my comment there is if only Lyell and Darwin knew the rapid erosion that's actually occurring today. And I'm going to show you some photographs of a cliff that's in the process of just falling down. You can see those what were they, apartments or whatever. They wouldn't have been constructed that close to the edge. That's a huge amount of erosion that's occurred, even though they're trying to reduce it by putting those rock faces at the base. It's still occurring. You can see there some of these pictures, by the way, I got from Nephilim Free. So thanks, Nev. He's a great wealth of information, Nev. Here's a picture 4 years apart. You can see the amount of erosion that's occurred on the coast under that bridge. I think it says, more than 30 feet per year. There's some more coastal erosion. Another example, 80,000 acres of coastal wetland are lost annually. This is in the United States. Martin McKinney, 82, has lost 20 meters of his block there in the last 20 years. He has lived there and expects his home to be on the cliff edge in 60 years.
Now, keep that slide up there and let me make a comment based on what we've said in the past.
Yep.
One of the creationist arguments is that most of the people in the pre-flood world, Dr. Henry Morris thinks 1 billion, others think 100 million, lived within a few miles of the coast. And so imagine a tsunami hitting these cliffs. Those houses, those people would be buried in deep basins. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I was just going to present a number of studies that have been done on the erosion rates of rocks, etc., that that sort of support our young Earth creation views rather than the deep time. You can see there I've highlighted this uplift balances erosion scenario is not true, because if it were true, then most of it, if not all, rivers in the world would form canyons in their upper sections. What they're actually saying there is, if you can imagine a river on a flat block, on a flat land, eroding the surface, as it uplifts, it will continue to erode, and therefore that you should be expecting a great canyons of at least 3,000 meters in depth.
Yes, very true.
Another study, eroding ages. The measurements show that some rivers are excavating their basins by more than 1 meter of height in 1,000 years, while others move at only 1 millimeter in 1,000 years. The average height reduction for all the continents of the world is about 60 millimeters or 6 centimeters per year. Now, the problem has been highlighted by a number of geologists who calculated that North America would have been leveled in 10 million years if erosion has continued at the average rate. Now, we've covered this with Sal Giardina and with Professor McQueen in previous streams that we've done. But here's another study that suggests an average rate of 6 centimeters per 1,000 years, which would remove a volume equivalent to that of the United States above sea level in 11 or 12 million years. So all the evidence, the empirical evidence, points to a young Earth, and it dispels the deep Earth story, I guess you can call it a story.
Exactly. Now, we're coming down to our last 10 minutes here. May I go ahead and answer to this criticism from Biologos about the...
Just one thing, David, before you go into that. In the origin of the species, Darwin says, being formed of worn and rounded pebbles, each of which bears the stamp of time. Here's a picture of Surtsey. We've mentioned Surtsey a number of times. Look at all those rounded rocks. That only happened within a decade, not millions of years.
Yes.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and we go to the question.
Okay. I do have some concluding comments, but I want to answer this question that came from someone reading Biologos. The question is this. The Grand Canyon supergroup, which I've labeled at the bottom of my diagram there, they say is tilted and so forth. The Grand Canyon's got the more familiar horizontal layers. Critics say that flood geologists cannot explain that. Well, it turns out, gentlemen, you're wrong. You'll have to come to one of our Darwin, George, and Smooth Dave concerts, and we'll get you a backstage pass, and I'll explain this to you. But I, for one, have an explanation. Let me give it to you. You see where I've put the word PF. That stands for pre-flood. The word is antediluvian, used in the old literature. I live in the southern part of the United States. Any house built before the Civil War, before 1860, is called an antebellum house before the war. This is an antediluvian set of group of rocks here. And the Grand Canyon supergroup is basically devoid of fossils. And then there you see my tree, which is an indicator that I'm drawing a cross section. And we know the flood begins, and we've got the trilobites in the Tapete sandstone. Well, how do you explain that Grand Canyon supergroup? Well, keep in mind that the Bible teaches that Methuselah lived 969 years. Also keep in mind that the flood occurred in the days of Noah. And so if you look at from the creation week up to the beginning of the flood, and you use only the information that Methuselah was 969 years, probably died the year of the flood, you've got at least 9 centuries there. And during that time, and during the events of the flood year, the events of the creation week, you have ample time for non-fossil bearing sedimentary rocks to be formed, lava flows such are found in the supergroup. So there's an adequate amount of time for that to have been formed and what's the correct word? Not only formed, but tilted during the third day of creation. So there is an adequate explanation for the non-fossil bearing sediments below what's called the Great Unconformity. George, back to you, my friend.
That's a great response, Professor McQueen. And I think a future show, since we hear these arguments from Biologos being repeated so frequently, Professor McQueen, a good idea for a future show may be to gather the arguments from Biologos and do an entire show debunking them in detail.
Well, why don't we find the big boss of Biologos and have him debate me in August? If they're supposed to be so knowledgeable, why can't he present the arguments?
Amen. Well said. Well said, Professor McQueen. If they're so confident that deep time and uniformitarianism is true, you'd think that they would be confident enough to debate it live. So well said, Professor McQueen.
You know, my attitude about these future debates, George, is if the Biologos group or other theistic evolutionist group don't like me, what can they do? Can they send me to Vietnam? Oh, no, that ended in 1975. Can they send me to Afghanistan? Oh, that's ending this year. The worst thing they can do is take Mrs. McQueen's chocolate chip cookies away from them.
Standing.
Yeah.
Can you bring up that that little picture of the scientist with a blindfold on there on the screen?
Let me find it. It's oftentimes the way PhDs from Biologos read young Earth creation technical literature. Let me see if here it is. There's the boss from BioLogos reading Professor McQueen's technical papers.
keep that on the screen, because I've got a point to make. Even way back in Darwin's days, they knew about erosion rates, but they just couldn't accept the realities of what it's actually stating. Darwin's actually quoting a geologist here. He says, Mr. Kroll shows by calculating the known amount of sediment annually brought down by certain rivers relatively to the areas of drainage that 1,000 feet of solid rock, as it became gradually disintegrated, would thus be removed from the mean level of the whole area in the course of 6 million years. This seems an astonishing result, and some considerations lead to the suspicion that it may be too large, but it halved or quartered. It is still very surprising. They even knew back then, because if you do some quick maths, that 1,000 feet is 12,000 inches over 6 million years. That's 2,000 inches per million years, or 2 inches per 1,000 years. This figure closely relates to the modern found figure of 6 centimeters per 1,000 years, 2 inches being 5 centimeters. So even back then, they knew about erosion rates, but they just didn't want to look at that particular evidence because it was going against their narrative. And they do that today. They still do that today. So much of the evidence that points to young Earth creationism and away from evolution, that they won't accept it.
Yeah, well, let me go in here. Thank you for putting my book up there. I appreciate that. It's available on Amazon. I see we have about 10 minutes left. So can I give a 5-minute summary and then turn the rest of it over to George?
Absolutely, Professor McQueen.
I happen to have William Paley's watch. You may recall that Paley wrote extensively. Let me get it open here. There we go. Paley said that if you're walking on a beach and you find a watch, what did he say? There must be a watchmaker. Darwin extensively read Paley's work when he was getting his Bible degree at the University of Edinburgh. He knew all about the watch and the watchmaker argument. And why Darwin did not retain his interest, his belief in the Bible, is one of the most sad and remarkable parts of his biography. As I mentioned earlier, Ms. McQueen and I have been working for several years on a 20-minute skit or play that depicts a supper table argument between his wife, Emma Darwin, and him after the birth of his many children, but most importantly, after the death of a favorite daughter. And perhaps in a future episode, Ms. McQueen and I can do this skit, but the summary of it is this. Darwin would have benefited by going in H.G. Wells' time machine forward to C.S. Lewis and reading C.S. Lewis's very famous book called The Problem of Pain. Darwin had an enormous problem with human suffering. He saw human suffering among the peoples of South America. He certainly was aware of the suffering of human trafficking in his day that was called slavery. And so Darwin would turn to his wife across the dinner table when she would try to get him to go to church with her. And he would say, no, there can't be a loving God because my favorite daughter died. Now let's pause for 5 seconds and just think about that. Okay, if God is all powerful, and in Psalms 100, it clearly teaches that God is good, how come an all powerful and good God would allow death, suffering, one of our children died before the little one was born. So we have 4 living children, but 5 total children, if you see what I'm saying, in my own experience. See, Darwin simply did not understand that the choice often depicted by the apple offered from Eve to Adam, it was Adam's fault. The sin of Adam, the introduction of sin into the world, that's the explanation for why people have children that die. That's the explanation of why everybody, everything has a lifespan, whether it's an oak tree or grandma or your mama or one of your own children. It's sad to me, actually, that as Darwin abandoned the truth of the Bible, he abandoned the hope of the Bible. He abandoned what it clearly says in the book of Revelation, and I've got that marked here in my Bible. He didn't rejoice in the fact that the Bible clearly teaches that there will be a time, Revelation 21, verse 1, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer a sea. I, John, saw the new Jerusalem coming down, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. One of our family friends is getting married Saturday, so we'll get to see a bride adorned for her husband. And it says that God's going to dwell with us, but here's the part that Darwin, at the end of his life, refused to believe, apparently. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, sorrow, crying, and there shall be no more pain. The former things will be passed away.
Amen. I love that passage.
It's a wonderful passage, George. Standing for truth, I'm going to end my time here since I'm about to get a sore throat, and we'll go rest for a while and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Well said.
David, can you bear another 5 minutes of my voice?
I want to hear it, George.
Okay. It's to cover one more topic before I actually present my concluding remarks. But Standing, I need you to share my screen again.
Go ahead, brother. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, it's to do with polystrate fossils. Okay. Now, in the Origins of Species, Darwin states it says, great fossilized trees still standing upright as they grew of many long intervals of time and changes of level during the process of deposition, which would not have been suspected had not the trees been preserved. Now, think about what he's saying there. He's saying long intervals of time, and he says the process of deposition and the trees being preserved. Who can tell me any tree? I can go in my backyard and see a couple of the trees that have died and are starting to rot. Okay, now he also quoted one person. Dawson found Carboniferous beds 1,400 feet thick in Nova Scotia, with ancient root-bearing strata one above the other at no less than 68 different levels. Now, this picture that you're seeing in front of you right now is something that Steve Austin actually commissioned. He did sonar studies at Spirit Lake at the Mount St. Helens, and you can see those trees literally sunken and deposited in silt in the upright position. Here's another photo of the logs becoming waterlogged and sinking down to the base in the upright position. Here's some photos of massive trees through multiple layers. You can see those layers, right? Each one of those layers would represent, in their view, hundreds of thousands to millions of years. There's another one. Look at the number of layers in that particular photo. and again. Okay, so for those that are interested, here's that article if you want to read it. It's a press release from the American Museum of Natural History. As I said, I think it's May 2021. It really sums up the gist of this review article. And
now, before George summarizes, can you give the screen back to me? I forgot Macbeth there. Let's go back to Macbeth just for a moment. Standing for Truth. I won't bore you with what all the witches say. When shall we three meet again? Perhaps next Wednesday, in thunder, lightning, or rain. And then it goes down, and the conclusion of what the witches say in Scene 1, Act 1 of Macbeth. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. Fair is foul. See, the problem with Darwin is he turned it on its head. What is fair, he called foul, and what is foul, he called fair. George?
Okay, well, just to conclude, I'll just share my last screen standing. You'll be happy with that.
You can share all day, brother. I'll always be happy. I love your information. Here we go. Give another 2 hours, George.
No worries. These are my closing remarks. Just to reiterate that passage from Darwin's book that that Professor McQueen had mentioned. I've got it highlighted there. It says, the war of nature from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life. I don't know how you can find grandeur in famine and death, but with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone circling on according to fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms of most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. What he's actually saying that he's actually worshipping creation, not the creator. This is what evolutionists do. They worship creation, not the creator. Now, these are my this is my concluding summary, all right? And I've been saying this ever since I saw the light. Now, please take note. Evolution is nothing more than presuppositions supported by vivid imagination, unproven and unverifiable assumptions, biased and subjective interpretations, outlandish speculation and conjecture grounded in untestable hypotheses, which makes evolution no more than just so stories. Reading The Origin of Species, it was true in Darwin's time, and it's still true today.
Amen. That's an excellent summary. And gentlemen, with that, I'm eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of life. So I'm
David, a nutritional fact. Don't throw away the core of the apple. Eat the entire lot.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
The seeds are healthy for you.
Very good.
An apple a day keeps the doctor away, brothers.
I will end with one old joke. You probably have heard it. Is it true that dyslexic atheists don't believe in dogs? D-O-G, G-O-D. Dyslexic atheists. You get it? G-O-D. They don't believe in dogs.
No.
Okay.
That's good.
Good night, friends.
Good night, brother.
Good on you,
McQueen,
David.
Thank you
God
so
bless
much
you.
for a fantastic show. This was awesome.
Say hello to
God
Shirley.
bless Professor McQueen. We'll see you next week. I'm looking forward to it. George, great show, great work, great research. This was 2 hours and 6 minutes. That was much needed. Everybody needs to see this program. Tons of great information. And at the same time, Professor McQueen demolished some common arguments from the skeptics that typically they repeat from biologos. So I just find it funny, George, we've got such a large team of professional creationists, informed creationists, and the critics. They are running scared. They are cornered, and they don't know what to do with the evidence. You'd think if they were so confident with their position, they'd be willing to defend it in live discussion. So it's 2021. It's a great time to be a young earth creationist, guys. The evidence is overwhelming, and you can tell that simply by the lack of response and lack of real rebuttal from the critics. So George, some final thoughts before we shut it down, brother?
Yeah, Standing. I actually presented about 50% of the things that I researched, because there was no way we could have, presented the entire lot in the 2 hours.
We got to do a part two.
But it's a good debate strategy, and it's also pertinent today. Keep them on the defense.
Amen.
And that's what these anti-creationists are now. They're on the defense. We have got the front row seat, and they're on the defense. So with that said, thanks again for having me on, and I took pleasure in doing some of this research, and I can't wait for a suggestion from Professor McQueen for our next topic. I hope he doesn't give me a day to research, though.
You're going to have to pull another all-nighter, George. So no, I'm excited for our next topic, and you're absolutely right. We got them on the defense, and you can see that. You can see that they're constantly trying to defend the evidence that we are putting forth. And they are just backed into a corner that I don't believe they are ever going to be able to get out. So this was phenomenal. As you know, we got a ton of great shows to look forward to. I'm excited to have Michael J. Ord back with us in June. Okay, next week, we've also got Kent back here with us. A few months ago, we had Kent on for the Garden of Eden and Noah's Flood. He gave a presentation followed by an audience Q&A. Now we're going to have him give a presentation on lies in the textbook, followed by an audience Q&A. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a show consisting of all of the topics from Dr. Dino's famous creation seminar. So that's something to look forward to as well, guys. And with that, once again, George, God bless. Good job. This was a lot of fun, and we will see you guys tomorrow for a debate on the 10 Commandments. It kicks off at 3 p.m. EST.
Love you, brother.
George and SFT are
out.